Well, good morning and welcome back for another week of Lent Readings for 2022. And we're going to begin this week as we continue the books of the New Testament with the Gospel of Luke. Now, Luke was written by Luke, the companion of Paul. All the early church fathers agreed that's who the author was. And he travelled around with Paul on his missionary journeys, collecting information and data, with no evidence that Luke himself was an eyewitness to Jesus, but he certainly collected information from those who were. And the end result of that was a 2-volume work, the first being the Gospel of Luke, and the second being the book of Acts, which we'll get to that later in the week. He says at the beginning it's written to someone called Theophilus, whose name means one who loves God, and some have suggested it's not written to a person but to the church. But I think it probably was written to a person, probably a high-ranking official, probably in Rome, maybe even the patron of Luke who helped finance his journeys. Luke records all the information together, including many things which aren't in the other Gospels, and he particularly focuses on a number of themes. One of the themes is prayer. He records prayer a lot. He records Jesus praying before major events, praying at his baptism, praying at the temptations, praying before choosing the disciples, praying in Gethsemane. He also focuses on the outcasts. So there's a lot mentioned about women, about the poor, about Gentiles, as Luke himself was. And what I want to read today is somewhere near the beginning from chapter 4. It's where Jesus has just returned from the temptations. He was baptized and by John the Baptist, goes into the desert, tempted by the devil, responds to those temptations with quoting scripture, and then it says he returns in the power of the Spirit. He goes to Nazareth, the place he grew up. He was born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, and enters a synagogue. And we're going to read what takes place next. So we're going to read from Luke 4, from verse 16. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. Jesus enters the synagogue, and as any Jewish man may teach, and he's been given a scroll to read. He unrolls it, and he unrolls it to Isaiah 61, and he reads a passage from there. Then he finishes, sits down, and there's quiet. The reason is this is one of the messianic passages, and everyone's looking in thinking, what's Jesus' take on the Messiah? What's he going to say next? And then after a pause, he says the most amazing thing. He says, "This scripture is fulfilled today in your hearing." You can imagine some confusion. They're saying, what's Jesus saying? Is he saying the Messiah's arrived? Surely he's not saying the Messiah is him. What's he on about? Jesus then goes on to stir things further. He says, a prophet is not recognised in his hometown. That's the bit immediately after the passage. And they're starting to think, hang on a minute, what's he saying now? And then he goes on to use illustration of two things from the Old Testament. One with Elijah and the woman of Zarephath, and then with Elisha and Naaman, using examples of a woman and a Gentile and a leper at that. And then it dawns on them. What he's saying is that these believing outcasts recognise more of what God is saying than the unbelieving Israelites, which is them. They get angry and they take Jesus to a cliff to throw him off, but he walks straight through the crowd. I want to go back a bit to that reading. Isaiah 61. Jesus reads it and he finishes with the words, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. And then he sits down. But that's not the whole of the passage. Actually, there's a comma there as it continues, and Jesus turned that comma into a full stop. Because if it continued, it would have said this: to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour, where he finished, then, and the day of the vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of the spirit of despair. And they will be called oaks of righteousness, are planted of the Lord for the display of his splendour. That next line, the day of the Lord's vengeance, you can imagine some of the people in the congregation that day, knowing the scripture, saying, hang on, Jesus has sat down before the best bit, the bit about the vengeance, the bit where God will take vengeance on his enemies, who will set us free. Why did he stop there? He stopped there because Jesus has two comings. And the first one was to proclaim freedom to the oppressed, to proclaim sight to the blind, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. It's when he comes a second time that he'll proclaim judgment. And we live on that full stop, the time between his first and second coming. We live now in the year of the Lord's favour, before he returns again and brings judgment. Let's reflect upon that and live that out. Until next time, have a blessed day.